In standard microeconomics, markets operate on an assumption of perfect, frictionless exchange. This is the foundation of the Coase theorem, the idea that as long as there are no transaction costs, the initial allocation of property rights shouldn't matter. If someone else values an item more than you do, you will trade it, and the market will reach a perfect equilibrium. This relies on a concept called reversible preferences. If you prefer a coffee mug over a chocolate bar when you start with nothing, you should still prefer the mug if you happen to be handed the chocolate bar first. Your starting position shouldn't dictate what you actually want. Look at this diagram modeling those two dimensions. In a perfect market, that particle slides smoothly between options based on pure utility. But when economists test this in reality, that smooth exchange breaks down. The consumer gets trapped, stuck at their initial starting node. This friction is known as the endowment effect. People seem to attach additional value to things simply because they already own them. Researchers Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler quantified this using the valuation paradigm. They split subjects into two groups: buyers who state their willingness to pay to acquire an item, and sellers who state their willingness to accept cash to give that same item up. The results consistently broke standard economic models. People randomly endowed with an item demanded roughly twice as much cash to sell it as buyers were willing to pay to acquire it. For decades, the economics profession accepted a straightforward explanation for this gap. They assumed it was driven purely by the static state of current legal ownership. You own the item, so losing it triggers a psychological penalty known as loss aversion. Valuation follows the mathematics of forward-looking expectations, regardless of the physical object currently held. Ownership alone is an insufficient trigger. In the early 2000s, economists Charles Plott and Catherine Zeiler published a severe critique of the classic valuation paradigm. They suspected the massive gap between buying and selling prices emerged from flawed laboratory design rather than a genuine feature of human preference. Plott and Zeiler reran the experiments but applied strict procedural controls. First, they introduced paid practice rounds, allowing subjects to get comfortable with the act of trading before the real test began. Second, they ensured strict anonymity. Subjects made their choices in private, eliminating any psychological pressure to appear like a tough negotiator in front of their peers. Third, they used a precise elicitation tool called the Becker-de-Groot-Marchak mechanism. This ensured that subjects couldn't rely on simple buy low, sell high heuristics, eliminating any misconceptions about the trading rules. This split-screen chart illustrates the inversion. Under these controlled conditions, the gap between willingness to pay and willingness to accept didn't just shrink, it vanished. The mean buying price actually rose slightly above the selling price. This vulnerability wasn't contained to the laboratory. Economist John List took the inquiry into the real world to see how active markets handled endowments. List set up exchange experiments at physical sports card and pin shows, targeting attendees with varying degrees of market exposure. He found that casual, inexperienced traders displayed a strong reluctance to part with their items, perfectly matching the classic laboratory anomalies. But highly experienced dealers, the people making trades every day, exhibited zero endowment effect. List isolated the variable of experience through a randomized control trial, paying casual traders to gain market exposure over 6 months. He found that the active act of trading physically eroded their reluctance to part with an endowed item. Researchers Engelman and Hollard took this further. They forced a group of subjects to trade items in preliminary rounds. Once those subjects learned the procedure was not risky, their exchange asymmetry disappeared in the main test. This creates a glaring paradox. The fact that the pain of losing an item vanishes the moment subjects learn the trading rules or gain a little market experience suggests the conventional understanding of loss aversion is incomplete. If simple procedural tweaks and market familiarity can erase the friction of exchange, the foundational assumption of ownership-based loss aversion must be discarded. In 2006, economists Botond Kozegi and Matthew Rabin published a theoretical framework that solved the Plott-Zeiler paradox. Their primary innovation was decoupling a person's reference point from their current physical ownership. They proposed that the reference point is a dynamically constructed calculation of your recent expectations about your future utility. The mathematical consequence of this theory is absolute. If you ex ante expect to trade an item, giving it up is no longer neurologically processed as a loss. The gain-loss utility term zeroes out. Economists Keith Erickson and Andreas Fuster designed a laboratory experiment to explicitly test this expectation hypothesis. They started with the classic baseline, endowing all subjects with a physical university mug. Look at the testing conditions mapped out for these two cohorts. The researchers introduced a probability variable. The first group had a 10% chance to trade their mug for a pen. The second group had a 90% probability. The data shows a shift. Only 23% of the low probability group traded, but the high probability group surged to 57%. Look at the psychological state of the 10% group. Because the option to trade was highly unlikely, their mental reference point crystallized around keeping the mug. When the trade was finally offered, giving up the mug registered as a painful loss. The 90% group operated under a different baseline. Because they fully expected the trade to happen, they integrated the pen into their reference point before making a decision. This allowed them to evaluate the items based on their raw utility rather than the fear of losing an endowment. This elegantly explains the Plot and Zeiler laboratory results. By running extensive instructions and practice rounds, the experimenters implicitly communicated to the subjects that trading was expected. That expectation neutralized the endowment effect before the final experiment even began. Your brain preemptively adjusts its baseline utility to match probability. If you anticipate a transaction, you neutralize the endowment effect before the exchange ever occurs. This model maps the true nature of valuation. The endowment effect is an observable reality, but it requires multiple reference variables to align. Valuation isn't a single switch triggered by a property deed. It is a calculation driven by physical proximity, historical ownership, reference prices, and most importantly, expected probability. Secondary variables like holding the item in your hand or feeling like you earned it through a specific task can artificially inflate your baseline attachment. Moving from behavioral theory to applied economics, we can see how manipulating this fluid reference point dictates real-world incentive design. Researchers Tanjim Hossain and John List tested this in a field experiment tracking factory worker productivity. The standard corporate framing relies on positive reinforcement, promising workers a future financial bonus if they hit a specific performance threshold. They tested this against an experimental loss framing. They awarded workers a provisional lump sum bonus immediately, but stipulated that the money would be clawed back if they underperformed. The monetary values were identical, but the productivity outcomes were not. The clawback framing significantly outperformed the standard promise of a future gain. This aligns with data from a study on educational incentives by Fryer and colleagues. Teachers given upfront bonuses framed as potential losses drastically raised their students' math test scores compared to those offered standard performance bonuses. The mechanism of expectation provided the leverage, bypassing the influence of the physical cash. By awarding the money upfront, the researchers established the expectation of ownership. Survey data ruled out liquidity constraints. The teachers weren't just spending the money early and working hard to pay off a debt. It was a psychological shift driven by expectation. Architecting what the user expects to happen next dictates final valuation more effectively than simply granting current property rights. This expectation baseline is the actual frontier of incentive design.